They said Italy would never cross the line, that no European nation would ever weaponize the system that holds them all together. But 1 minute ago, Rome didn't just cross the line, it erased it. This is not a warning. This is not a negotiation tactic. What Italy just activated is something Brussels has spent years trying to make impossible, not because it was illegal, not because it was unrealistic, but because if it was ever used, it would expose a structural weakness at the heart of Europe that no treaty can fix. And now that weakness is no longer theoretical, it is operational. For months, pressure has been building beneath the surface of the European system. Quiet disputes over budgets, silent disagreements over energy flows, technical arguments buried inside committees that most people have never heard of. On the surface, everything looked stable. Markets moved. Governments issued statements. The machine kept running. But inside that machine, something was shifting. Something that only a handful of analysts noticed at the time. Italy was preparing, not publicly, not through speeches or threats, but through legal positioning, through infrastructure control, through mechanisms that already existed, written deep into agreements that were never meant to be tested like this. Agreements that assumed cooperation, agreements that assumed trust, assumptions that no longer exist. The trigger came faster than anyone expected. A sequence of decisions inside Brussels that, on paper, looked routine. Adjustments to funding channels, reallocations tied to green transition priorities, technical changes that required no headlines and attracted no attention. But when those changes were mapped together, they revealed something far more dangerous. A redirection of economic power away from Southern Europe toward a system that favored Northern industrial recovery. And at the center of that system, Germany. Rome saw it clearly, not as policy, not as coincidence, but as architecture, a structure designed to weaken Italy's fiscal position at the exact moment it could least afford it. Rising borrowing costs, slowing growth, increasing dependence on external support. It was not a single move. It was a strategy, and Italy decided to respond, but not through the channels Brussels expected, not with statements, not with negotiations. Italy went directly to the one lever that bypasses the entire European institutional framework, a lever that does not require approval, does not require consensus, and once activated, cannot be easily reversed. Energy. Specifically, control over one of the most critical transit corridors feeding into Central Europe, a corridor that Germany depends on to keep its industrial base alive. For years, this dependency was acknowledged quietly, but never addressed seriously, because fixing it would have required admitting just how fragile the system had become. Now that fragility is exposed, Italy has activated a legal mechanism embedded in its bilateral agreements, a mechanism that allows it to interrupt energy flow under the justification of infrastructure management. On paper, it is routine, maintenance scheduling, operational adjustments, nothing that suggests conflict. But in reality, it is something else entirely, a pressure point, a switch, and that switch has now been touched. Inside Germany, the reaction was immediate. Not public panic, not yet, but something more telling. Emergency consultations between industrial leaders, energy security teams running worst-case scenarios, government officials trying to calculate how long the system can hold if the flow is disrupted. The answers they are getting are not reassuring, because this is not just about energy supply, it is about timing. Germany is already under economic strain. Growth is weak, industrial confidence is low, political stability is fragile. The system is holding together, but only just. And into that fragile system, Italy has introduced uncertainty at the exact point that cannot absorb it. A disruption of days becomes a crisis of weeks. A crisis of weeks becomes something much harder to contain. Production lines stop, contracts fail, markets react, confidence collapses. And once that process begins, it does not wait for political solutions. That is why this moment matters, because Italy is not just applying pressure, it is applying pressure with precision, at a point where Germany cannot easily respond without escalating further, at a point where Brussels cannot intervene without exposing its own role in what led to this confrontation. And behind all of this, there is one question that no one in Europe is answering publicly right now. Did Italy activate this mechanism as a warning or as the first step in something much bigger? There is a detail that changes everything. It did not appear in headlines. It was not announced in a press conference. But inside government circles, it moved faster than any official statement because it signaled one thing with absolute clarity. This was not a bluff. Hours before Italy activated the mechanism, a quiet internal shift took place. A shift that only happens when a government moves from planning to execution. Key operational authority over energy infrastructure was pulled out of advisory channels and placed directly under central command. Not debated, not delayed, transferred immediately. That kind of move is not made for negotiation. It is made for action. And Berlin understood that. Because within minutes of confirming what had happened, the German response changed. Until that point, officials believed this was pressure. Aggressive, yes. Strategic, definitely. But still reversible. Still something that could be managed through back channels, concessions, or time. That assumption is now gone. The calls that followed did not go through official EU systems. They bypassed Brussels entirely. They went directly to Rome, to contacts built over years, to relationships designed for exactly this kind of moment. But what they found was not resistance. It was silence, coordinated silence. Access points that had always been open were suddenly closed. Officials who were reachable hours earlier were now unavailable. Messages were acknowledged but not answered. Conversations delayed, redirected, blocked, not randomly, systematically. That is not confusion. That is a signal. It means the decision has already been made. Inside Germany's industrial core, the realization came even faster because they do not deal in politics. They deal in consequences, and the consequences here are immediate. Factories that depend on uninterrupted energy flow cannot pause without cost, in some cases without permanent damage. Supply chains built on precision timing cannot absorb uncertainty measured in days, let alone weeks. Internal models began circulating, not for public release, not for media, for survival planning. And the numbers inside those models point to something Berlin cannot politically survive if this continues, because this is not happening in isolation. Germany is already balancing economic slowdown with political pressure, a coalition that relies on stability to maintain credibility, a recovery narrative that depends on momentum. Remove that momentum, even briefly, and the entire structure begins to weaken. Italy knows this. And more importantly, Italy chose this moment, not randomly, not emotionally, but mathematically. At the exact intersection where Germany's political timeline, economic fragility, and institutional dependence all overlap. A window that does not stay open for long. But while it is open, it creates leverage that is almost impossible to counter without cost. And now, that window is active. Brussels finds itself in a position it was never designed to handle. Because any attempt to intervene risks confirming the very imbalance Italy is accusing it of creating. Any attempt to stay silent allows the situation to escalate unchecked. There is no neutral ground left, no safe response, which means the center of control has shifted away from institutions, away from committees, away from the system itself. It now sits with one decision, one signature, because the mechanism Italy activated does not stop here. What has been triggered is only the first phase, a controlled action, limited in scope, reversible, but only for a short time. The real impact comes next. If the process continues, the disruption becomes structural, not temporary, not symbolic, structural. And Germany cannot allow that to happen. But stopping it requires something Berlin may not be willing to do. It requires stepping back, publicly, conceding ground inside a system where perception is power, where any sign of weakness carries consequences far beyond this crisis. So the clock is no longer just about energy, it is about decisions, and that clock is running out. Because somewhere right now, inside a room that no cameras can see, a document is sitting on a desk. It has already been prepared, already reviewed, already authorized in principle, waiting for one final step, a signature that turns pressure into reality, a signature that transforms a hidden vulnerability into a visible crisis. And if that signature happens, what exactly is left to stop what comes next? At this point, the crisis is no longer building. It is stabilizing into something far more dangerous because once a system stops reacting and starts adapting to conflict, it becomes harder to reverse. What changed in the last hour is not what Italy did. It is how everyone else is now behaving around it. Markets are no longer waiting for clarification. They are repositioning, quietly at first, then all at once. Energy futures are moving not on supply data, but on political probability. Industrial stocks tied to continuous production are beginning to price in disruption scenarios that just 24 hours ago were considered too extreme to model seriously. This is how modern economic conflict spreads, not through announcements, but through expectations. And expectations have shifted. Inside Germany, the pressure is no longer contained within government offices. It is spreading outward. Corporate leaders are no longer asking what Rome intends to do. They are asking how long they have before they must act independently, before they shut down lines, before they activate contingency plans that were never meant to be used outside of wartime conditions. Because that is what this is starting to resemble. Not a war with weapons, a war with systems. And systems do not break loudly. They fail in sequences, one dependency at a time, one interruption triggering another, until what looked stable suddenly is not. Berlin is now facing a decision that has no clean outcome. If it pushes back, it escalates. If it concedes, it weakens. If it delays, it risks losing control of the timeline entirely. And the timeline is everything, because Italy is not reacting anymore. It is executing. Every hour that passes without reversal moves the situation deeper into a phase where actions become harder to undo. Legal mechanisms begin locking into place. Operational schedules move forward. Infrastructure decisions cross points where stopping them creates more damage than continuing them. This is the part of the crisis where options begin to disappear, and Brussels knows it. That is why the silence has not broken, not because there is nothing to say, but because there is no version of the truth that reduces the damage. Any acknowledgement confirms the structure Italy is challenging. Any denial risks triggering proof that Rome appears fully prepared to release. So the system waits. But Italy is not waiting. Because the final stage of this mechanism was never designed to be debated in public. It was designed to be activated quietly and felt immediately. And now, attention is shifting to one final question that determines everything that follows. Not whether Germany can respond, not whether Brussels can intervene, but whether Italy is about to go all the way. Because if the next phase is triggered, this stops being a crisis between two countries. It becomes a test of whether the European system itself can survive one member state using its own rules against it. And right now, with the clock still running, with pressure still building, and with that single signature still missing, the only thing no one in Europe can say for certain is this: has the decision already been made?